Picture this. You wake up inside the most beautiful palace on earth. Gold everywhere, marble floors, chandeliers the size of carriages, hundreds of servants waiting for your slightest command. Outside your window, perfect gardens stretch toward the horizon. Fountains catch the morning light. Every wall, every mirror, every painted ceiling tells you the same thing. You live at the most glamorous address in the world. Now take a breath. Yes, that smell. That is the smell of thousands of people who have not properly bathed in weeks. People packed shoulder to shoulder inside a building with barely any functional toilets. The smell of chamber pots being thrown out of windows. Open cesspits cooking under the French summer sun. Unwashed wigs crawling with lice. Welcome to Versailles. Welcome, dear viewers, to another episode of World Stories, where we scrape away the golden surface of history to reveal what was rotting underneath. And today, we are going all the way. Before we dive into the filth, and believe me, we will dive deep, we need to understand why Versailles was a disaster waiting to happen. In 1682, Louis XIV, the Sun King, the most powerful monarch in Europe, made a decision that would reshape European history. He permanently moved the entire royal court from Paris to Versailles, a former hunting lodge about 12 miles outside the city, which he had spent decades transforming into the most spectacular palace ever built. It sounds like a power move, and it absolutely was. But it was also, as we are about to see, a catastrophic public health experiment. Louis did not move to Versailles because it was especially suitable for human life. He moved there because it gave him control. By forcing the French nobility to live around him at Versailles, Louis neutralized them. They could not plot against him from their provincial estates if they were too busy fighting for the privilege of watching him eat dinner. The palace was a beautiful, gilded trap, and so they came by the thousands. At its peak, the Palace of Versailles and its surrounding buildings housed somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 people, nobles and their families, servants, government officials, military officers, priests, craftsmen, diplomats, visitors, curious members of the public. Because yes, Versailles was essentially a semi-public space. Ordinary people could walk in and see the machinery of absolute monarchy up close. But here was the problem. The palace was spectacular. It was not designed to support that many human beings for that long. The plumbing was primitive. Sanitation was an afterthought. The kitchens were enormous but compromised. And as more and more people arrived, a building that was already struggling became something truly, magnificently disgusting. Let's begin with the most basic human question. Where did everyone go to the bathroom? That is the question. The big one. The one that haunts you every time you look too closely at a beautiful historical place. The short answer? Everywhere. Versailles had an almost criminal shortage of proper sanitation for a building of that size and population. Louis XIV did commission some toilets, mostly latrines built into alcoves or under staircases. There were also more than 300 commodes, elegant wooden chairs with chamber pots hidden beneath the seat, placed throughout the palace for the royal family and high nobility. There were also small private closets, the closest thing the palace had to proper bathroom spaces. That sounds reasonable until you do the math. 300 chamber pots. For up to 10,000 people, you can calculate the ratio yourself. For the vast majority of people living and working at Versailles, lower-ranking nobles, servants, craftsmen, visitors, decent access to a toilet simply did not exist, so they improvised. Contemporary accounts describe people relieving themselves in corridors, behind curtains, on staircases, and against the walls of the gardens. Men were recorded urinating from balconies. Women were said to lift their skirts and simply do what they had to do, wherever they stood. The famous court chronicler Saint-Simon wrote that one princess had the charming habit of urinating while walking, leaving behind a trail that her servants had to wipe up after her. Some visitors, hoping to be discreet, hid inside fireplaces. A report from 1675 about the Louvre gives us a taste of the situation that would become even worse at Versailles. The grand staircase was covered in human waste, and the smell was described as 1,000 unbearable stenches. Even Louis XIV himself became concerned enough to issue a royal decree ordering the palace corridors to be cleaned of excrement at least once a week. And where did all that waste go? For servants and lower-ranking residents, often straight out the window. The combination of cold, damp, overcrowding, and poor nutrition made respiratory disease a permanent companion. For servants at the bottom of the hierarchy, the situation was brutal. They slept wherever they could, ate whatever was left, had no real access to sanitation, and lived in conditions that even by 17th century standards could be recognized as slum-like. Food at Versailles deserves special attention. On the surface, it was extraordinary. Louis XIV was famous for his enormous appetite. Supposedly, in a single sitting, he could eat 4 bowls of soup, an entire pheasant, a partridge, salad, mutton, ham, pastries, fruit, and boiled eggs. The royal kitchens were vast, with hundreds of cooks, pastry chefs, sauce specialists, and experts of every kind. But the logistics of feeding thousands of people inside one building, without reliable refrigeration, with a plumbing system that regularly failed, and with kitchens far from the dining rooms and potentially contaminated by sewage backing up from below, made food safety a constant problem. The distance between the royal kitchens and the royal table was considerable. Food was prepared, placed into covered silver dishes, and carried through long corridors and staircases. By the time it reached the table, it was often cold. Cold food that had traveled through the corridors of Versailles was also food that had spent time at temperatures perfect for bacterial growth. The contamination problems went deeper. Water for cooking came from sources that were also compromised by the palace's failures in waste disposal. The kitchens were infested with rats and mice. Cats kept them partially under control, but never eliminated them. Pests got into the food stores, and when sewage occasionally backed up into kitchen spaces, the consequences entered the food chain directly. The medical results were predictable. Gastrointestinal disease was endemic at court. Royal doctors prescribed purgatives and enemas as treatment, which, combined with the original problem, kept the king and courtiers in a state of almost constant digestive misery. Everything we have discussed so far now comes together in the inevitable health consequences for the people who lived at Versailles. Syphilis was rampant, as we mentioned, but it was not the only serious infectious disease that found a home in the palace of the Sun King. Smallpox broke out twice in Paris in the early 18th century. Typhoid fever, spread through contaminated food and water, was a constant threat. Louis XIV himself survived an attack of typhoid. Dysentery, known as bloody flux, was common and often deadly, especially among children. The royal family was not spared. Infant mortality at Versailles was horrifying by modern standards. Louis XIV outlived most of his legitimate heirs. When he died in 1715, he was the last surviving member of his immediate family, having watched an entire generation of successors disappear before him. And tuberculosis, then called consumption, cut down courtiers with depressing regularity. The combination of overcrowding, poor ventilation, inadequate nutrition, and constant stress created ideal conditions for disease. Because life at Versailles, despite the luxury, was politically brutal and exhausting. The truly eerie thing is that nobody understood why any of this was happening. The connection between contaminated water and typhoid, between fecal contamination and dysentery, between overcrowding and tuberculosis, none of it was understood. To give some credit to the later kings of Versailles, the hygiene problem was not completely ignored. Louis XVI, who came to the throne in 1774, launched a more serious sanitation campaign in the early years of his reign. He dug new drains, added toilets, and tried to systematize waste disposal. He also installed English-style water closets with real flushing mechanisms and connections to underground channels in several locations. But by that point, Versailles already had a century of structural damage behind it. Rotting pipes, collapsing cesspits, dirt embedded into the building itself. The reforms were sincere but insufficient. The core problem, too many people, too little sanitation, was never solved. And then came the revolution. And the problem became irrelevant. Here's what hits me every time I look into Versailles. We look at the paintings, the golden halls, the magnificent portraits, the silk, the satin, the diamonds, the mirrors, and we see something timeless, something aspirational. But the reality of Versailles was that by almost any practical standard, it was a less sanitary environment than a well-run medieval monastery. Louis XIV built a monument to his own glory, but he also built a monument to what happens when aesthetics and politics are placed above basic human needs. The people who lived there were not unaware of the problem, so they put on another wig, changed their shirt for the third time that day, and carried on. That is the rotten ages rule, isn't it? Under every glittering surface, something is rotting. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a comment below, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me which rotten corner of history you want me to dig up next. Until then, brush your teeth. Seriously.